We tested every GPU under 500 in 2026. One card dominates 1440p. Another wins esports 1080p. See real frames per second across 12 games, VRAM breakdowns, and exactly which to buy. We focused on cards available at or below 500 SRP in Q1 2026. Street prices fluctuate, but these 5 represent the realistic options most builders encounter. Cards tested: Intel Arc B580, $249, AMD RX 7700 XT, $349, NVIDIA RTX 4060 Ti 8GB, $390, NVIDIA RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, $499, and AMD RX 7800 XT occasionally drops to $480 on sale. Each was tested in an identical system, Ryzen 7 7800. X3D 32GB, DDR5 6000, and 1TB Gen 4 NVMe. Test suite included Warzone 3, Fortnite, Valorant, Apex Legends, esports, Cyberpunk 2077, Baldur's Gate 3, Hogwarts Legacy, Starfield, The Last of Us Part 1, AAA single player, and 3 2026 launches. We measured average frames per second. The RX 7700 XT dominates this bracket for most buyers. It averaged 118 frames per second at 1440p high across our APOA suite versus 89 frames per second for the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB and 102 frames per second for the Arc B580. At 1080p, the gap narrowed, but the 7700 XT still led with 164 frames per second versus 151 frames per second Arc and 138 frames per second RTX 4060 Ti. VRAM matters here. The 7700 XT ships with 12 GB, giving headroom for texture packs and future-proofing that the 4060 Ti 8GB lacks. In Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p Ultra with no ray tracing, the 7700 XT delivered 94 frames per second with 1% lows at 78 frames per second. The same scenario dropped the Arc B580 offers shocking value at $249. You get 12 GB VRAM, solid 1080p performance, and competitive 1440p in esports titles. It averaged 151 frames per second at 1080p high across our suite and 98 frames per second at 1440p high. That beats the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB in VRAM heavy games and costs $150 less. The catch is driver maturity and inconsistent performance in older DX11 titles. In Warzone 3 at 1080p competitive settings, the B580 hit 187 frames per second with 1% lows at 142 frames per second. Fortnite Performance Mode delivered 236 frames per second, and Valorant maxed our 366 Hz test monitor. For esports-focused builds on a tight budget, the B580 punches above its price, but in Baldur's, if ray tracing is non-negotiable, the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB wins despite its high price. It delivered 63 frames per second in Cyberpunk at 1080p RT Medium versus 52 frames per second for Arc B580, 48 frames per second for RX 7700 XT, and 47 frames per second in Portal Art versus 38 frames per second Arc, 29 frames per second AMD. NVIDIA's RT cores remain a generation ahead, and DLSS 3-frame generation pushed Cyberpunk to 98 frames per second at 1440p RT Medium, where the 7700 XT managed only 71 frames per second with FSRE 3. The 16 GB VRAM model solves the primary complaint about the 4060 Ti line. At 1440p Ultra, in The Last of Us Part 1, VRAM usage peaked at 11.8. The RX 7800 XT normally retails at $549, placing it outside this bracket. But January 2026 sales dropped it to $499 at multiple retailers, making it a temporary contender. At that price, it's the outright performance king. We measured 132 frames per second at 1440p high across our APOA suite, 12% ahead of the 7700 XT and 31% ahead of the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB. VRAM jumps to 16 gigabytes, power draw rises to 263 watts, and you get the same RDNA 3 architecture with more compute units. Cyberpunk at 1440p Ultra ran at 104 frames per second with 1% lows at 88 frames per second, Starfield pushed to 96 frames per second, and The Last of Us hit 118. Power efficiency matters for small form factor builds and electricity cost sensitive regions. The RTX 4060 Ti 8GB pulled 160 watts during our Cyberpunk loop, making it compatible with budget 500 watts PSUs. The Arc B5 Auto drew 185 watts, the RX 7700 XT hit 220 watts, the 4060 T16 gigabytes reached 165 watts, and the RX 7800 XT peaked at 263 watts. If you're running a 550 watts PSU, the 7800 XT leaves little headroom for CPU spikes. NVIDIA wins efficiency, Intel sits middle, AMD trails. Thermal output follows power draw. The RX 7700 XT ran at 74 degrees Celsius under sustained load in our open-air test bench with a triple fan design. The RTX 4060 Ti stayed at 65 degrees Celsius and the Arc. Most buyers in 2026 should choose the RX 7700 XT at $349. It delivers the best balance of 1080p and 1440p each performance, includes 12 gigabytes VRAM for longevity, and costs $150 less than the RTX 4060 Ti 16 gigabytes. You sacrifice some ray tracing capability and DLSS3, but gain 18% higher raster frames per second at 1440. Or if you play Chotoko A single-player titles, stream at 1440s, or want a card that will handle 2027 releases without VRAM bottlenecks, the 7700 XT is the clear pick. Esports and budget 1080p builders should grab the Arc B580 at $249. It delivers 150-plus frames per second in competitive titles, includes surprising 12 gigabytes VRAM, and costs half the price. Build your free playbook for any GPU at BetterFPS.com/optimize.